The hidden advantage of having nothing: most people feel powerless at the beginning, because they measure strength by what they own. They look at others who seem established, stable, and well-positioned, and they assume that power must start with resources. Money, status, connections, recognition. These become the markers by which people judge their starting point. When those markers are missing, the mind immediately interprets the situation as weakness. It feels as though the game has already begun and everyone else has arrived equipped while you stand empty-handed. But this perception hides something that very few people notice in the early stages of their journey. When you begin with nothing, you are not yet bound by the invisible chains that limit those who already possess something to lose. The individual who has reputation fears damaging it. The individual who has wealth fears losing it. The individual who has influence fears being exposed. Possession creates attachment, and attachment creates caution. And caution, while sometimes wise, often slows the ability to move freely. Starting with nothing removes this quiet pressure. When there is no image to defend and no expectations to maintain, your movements become less restricted. You are free to observe, experiment, and adjust without the constant anxiety of protecting something fragile. This creates a subtle psychological advantage. It is the advantage of flexibility, the advantage of learning without the weight of embarrassment, the advantage of failure that carries no social cost. Many people underestimate how powerful this condition can be. In fact, the early stage where nothing seems to exist is often the stage where the deepest internal structure is built. Without external validation to rely on, you are forced to confront yourself directly. Your discipline cannot depend on applause because there is none. Your direction cannot rely on external approval because nobody is watching closely enough to provide it. This environment quietly trains independence. When the outside world offers little reinforcement, the mind either collapses into frustration or begins to strengthen its internal compass. Those who collapse often interpret the absence of recognition as proof that their efforts are meaningless. But those who adapt begin to recognize a different pattern. They notice that when external noise disappears, the mind becomes clearer. Decisions become less reactive. Attention becomes easier to direct. What once looked like emptiness begins to reveal itself as space. Space to think, space to study patterns of behavior in others, space to understand how people reveal their motivations through subtle actions. Without the pressure to perform immediately, you can begin to observe the structure of environments and power dynamics that others rush past. This is one of the quiet advantages Machiavellian thinkers often recognized. The individual who begins from the margins has the opportunity to study the center more carefully than those already standing inside it. Observation becomes your early form of capital. In these early stages, emotional reactions become particularly important. When resources are limited, frustration is easy to justify. Impatience becomes tempting. The mind wants movement, progress, proof that effort is producing visible results. But this is where psychological maturity begins to separate individuals. Those who develop power from nothing learn to regulate this impatience. They begin to see time differently. Instead of demanding immediate reward, they treat the early phase as preparation. Each small act of discipline strengthens their internal stability. Each moment of restraint teaches them to act deliberately rather than impulsively. Over time, these small adjustments accumulate quietly, shaping the individual's ability to remain composed while others become distracted by short-term outcomes. Something subtle happens during this period. The absence of external pressure begins to cultivate internal authority. You stop asking whether others approve of your direction. Instead, you begin asking whether your actions align with the structure you are building within yourself. This shift is small at first, almost unnoticed. But it changes the relationship you have with uncertainty. Uncertainty stops feeling like danger and starts feeling like territory. Most people avoid uncertain environments because they associate them with risk. Yet when you begin with nothing, uncertainty becomes unavoidable. The question then becomes whether you treat that uncertainty as chaos or as opportunity. Those who learn to operate calmly within it gain an advantage over those who need stability before they can act. Gradually, the early sense of powerlessness transforms into something more controlled. You begin to recognize that what looked like a disadvantage was actually a stage where attachment had not yet taken hold. Without attachment, your focus sharpens. Without expectations, your experimentation expands. Without reputation, your movements become less predictable. And unpredictability, when combined with discipline, becomes a form of quiet strength. At this stage, the individual who once felt behind begins to notice something interesting about the people who appeared ahead. Many of them move carefully because they are protecting what they already possess. Their decisions are shaped by preservation rather than exploration. The one who started with nothing has already passed through a psychological training ground that others avoided. A training ground where identity is built internally rather than externally. a training ground where resilience forms not from success, but from the ability to continue without recognition. The hidden advantage of having nothing is that it forces the development of internal structure before external reward appears. It forces the individual to build discipline before influence, clarity before authority, and patience before visibility. In that quiet stage where nothing seems to exist, the foundations of real power begin to form within the mind of the person, who learns to remain steady, while the world sees emptiness, where structure is silently growing. Power begins with self-governance. The first misunderstanding people have about power is that they believe it begins with influence over others. They imagine power as the ability to persuade, dominate, control outcomes, or direct people toward a desired result. From this perspective, power looks external. It appears to depend on authority, reputation, resources, or social position. When someone lacks these things at the beginning, they assume power is simply unavailable to them. But this assumption overlooks a deeper psychological truth that becomes obvious only when you study human behavior carefully. The earliest and most reliable form of power does not involve other people at all. It begins with governance of the self. Most individuals underestimate how rare genuine self-governance actually is. Human behavior is largely reactive. People respond emotionally to criticism, praise, uncertainty, pressure, and comparison. Their attention shifts quickly depending on what the environment presents. Their decisions often follow moods rather than deliberate thinking. Because this pattern is so common, it becomes invisible. People assume emotional reactions are natural and unavoidable, yet the moment someone learns to regulate these reactions, a subtle shift occurs in how others perceive them. In social environments, stability stands out. When tension rises and one person remains composed, people instinctively notice the contrast. When disagreements escalate and one individual responds calmly instead of emotionally, the atmosphere around that person changes. It is not always obvious at first, but something begins to happen beneath the surface. Others become slightly more cautious, slightly more attentive, slightly more curious. The reason is simple. Emotional reactions reveal internal pressure. When someone reacts quickly with anger, defensiveness, or urgency, they unintentionally show where their emotional leverage points exist. They reveal what can disturb them, what can influence them, and what can push them off balance. Observant people notice these signals immediately, even if they cannot fully explain why. Self-governance removes many of these signals. When an individual learns to pause before reacting, they begin to control what others can read about them. Their emotional landscape becomes less visible. This does not mean they suppress emotions in an unhealthy way. Rather, they develop the ability to observe their own reactions before expressing them. That small space between stimulus and response becomes the foundation of psychological control. This space allows a person to choose behavior deliberately instead of impulsively. At the beginning, this skill feels unnatural. The mind is used to immediate responses. Someone challenges you, and the instinct is to defend yourself. Someone criticizes you, and the instinct is to justify your actions. Someone ignores you, and the instinct is to seek validation or recognition. These impulses are deeply ingrained, and resisting them requires conscious effort. But the moment you begin to interrupt these automatic reactions, something important begins to develop. Awareness expands. You start noticing patterns you previously missed. You begin to see how often people act emotionally without realizing it. You notice how conversations change direction based on small reactions. You observe how quickly attention shifts in response to confidence, hesitation, or uncertainty. Observation becomes easier when you are not constantly reacting. This creates a powerful psychological advantage. When others are focused on defending themselves or expressing their emotions, they are not observing the situation clearly. Their attention narrows. They become absorbed in their immediate feelings. The person who remains calm, however, retains the ability to watch the entire dynamic unfold. Over time, this calm observation turns into insight. You begin to understand how environments operate. You notice how individuals signal insecurity through over-explanation. You see how impatience often exposes desperation. You recognize that people frequently reveal their priorities through the intensity of their reactions. These observations are not available to someone who is emotionally entangled in every moment. Self-governance gradually shifts your role within social dynamics. Instead of being carried by the emotional momentum of a situation, you become someone who can stand slightly outside of it. You respond with intention rather than urgency. This controlled presence often makes others feel subtly unsettled at first, because they cannot easily predict your reaction. When people cannot read your emotional triggers, they lose a familiar reference point for influence. And when influence becomes difficult, respect often begins to emerge. This respect does not appear because you demand it. It appears because emotional stability signals internal structure. People instinctively trust individuals who seem anchored within themselves, even if they cannot articulate why. They recognize the difference between someone who reacts impulsively and someone who moves deliberately. What begins as simple emotional discipline gradually evolves into something more powerful. Your reactions become fewer but more precise. Your words become more measured. Your presence begins to carry weight because it is not scattered by constant emotional fluctuation. At this point, the idea of power starts to look very different from how it first appeared. It no longer feels like something you must acquire from outside circumstances. Instead, it feels like something that grows quietly as your internal environment becomes more stable. Self-governance transforms the relationship between you and the world around you. Situations that once provoked anxiety or defensiveness begin to feel manageable. Conflicts become easier to navigate because you are not emotionally entangled in them. Decisions become clearer because they are not driven by immediate emotional pressure. Gradually, you realize that influence over others is not the starting point of power, but the byproduct of something deeper. When a person governs their own reactions, their behavior becomes less predictable and more deliberate. This unpredictability forces others to adjust their expectations. And when people begin adjusting their behavior around your calm presence, it becomes clear that power did not begin with controlling others. It began with controlling yourself. Discipline compounds in silence. One of the most difficult psychological moments in any journey occurs when effort exists but recognition does not. You work, think, adjust, learn, and refine your behavior, yet nothing around you seems to acknowledge the movement taking place. There are no visible signs of progress, no external confirmation that what you are doing matters. In this phase, the mind begins to question itself. Doubt becomes louder, impatience grows stronger. It feels as if the world is moving forward while your own path remains invisible. Most people interpret this silence as failure. They assume that if progress were real, it would already be visible. They begin comparing their internal effort to the visible achievements of others. Someone else receives recognition. Someone else moves ahead socially or professionally. Someone else appears confident and established. The contrast becomes uncomfortable, and many people abandon their discipline at exactly this stage, because the mind struggles to tolerate effort that does not immediately produce visible reward. But what most individuals fail to notice is that this silent phase is not empty. It is formative. In fact, this period is often where the deepest psychological structure begins to form. When discipline is practiced without applause, it changes the relationship you have with your own behavior. Your actions are no longer tied to validation. They begin to stand independently of external attention. This creates a subtle but powerful transformation inside the mind. Instead of acting in order to be seen, you begin acting in order to remain aligned with a personal standard. This shift may appear small from the outside, but internally it restructures motivation. When behavior depends on recognition, consistency becomes fragile. A lack of attention can easily interrupt effort. But when behavior becomes tied to internal order rather than external reward, discipline becomes quieter and more stable. It stops fluctuating with circumstances. Silence becomes a training ground. In environments where recognition is absent, emotional reactions become more visible to yourself. Frustration surfaces. The urge to quit appears. The desire for reassurance becomes stronger. These moments reveal the emotional dependencies that often remain hidden when praise is present. Without external encouragement, the mind is forced to confront its own expectations. This confrontation is uncomfortable, but it is also instructive. You begin to see how much of your previous motivation depended on visibility, how much of your confidence depended on external confirmation, and how easily attention from others could influence your sense of direction. These realizations gradually reshape the way you approach effort. Instead of asking whether people are noticing your progress, you begin asking whether your behavior remains consistent with the person you are becoming. This question changes the emotional environment around discipline. The absence of recognition no longer feels like rejection. It begins to feel like privacy, a quiet space where development can occur without distraction. In this environment, the mind becomes less reactive and more deliberate. Deliberate behavior accumulates. Small acts of consistency, repeated quietly over time, begin to shape psychological resilience. You learn to continue working even when the environment provides no immediate encouragement. You learn to observe emotional discomfort without allowing it to dictate your actions. You learn to treat impatience as information rather than instruction. Gradually, something important begins to happen. The emotional intensity that once accompanied effort starts to fade. Discipline becomes calmer. Instead of feeling like a constant struggle against resistance, it begins to feel like a rhythm, a structure that organizes your behavior rather than something you must constantly force yourself to maintain. This transformation is rarely visible to others during the early stages. From the outside, it may still appear as though nothing significant is happening. But internally, the person who continues through this silent phase begins to develop stability that cannot be easily shaken by temporary setbacks. Emotional fluctuations lose some of their influence, urgency becomes less persuasive, the mind becomes more patient. Patience is a quiet form of power. When individuals lack patience, they often reveal their desperation through hurried decisions and reactive behavior. They chase immediate outcomes because waiting feels uncomfortable. But the person who has trained themselves through long periods of unseen effort begins to understand something different about time. They realize that meaningful change rarely appears suddenly. Instead, it accumulates slowly, often beneath the surface, before becoming visible. This understanding reduces the pressure to rush results. Actions become more thoughtful, decisions become less reactive. The individual becomes capable of maintaining direction, even when external signals remain uncertain. At this stage, the early silence that once felt discouraging begins to reveal its purpose. It trained the mind to operate without constant reassurance. It taught the individual how to remain focused while the world was distracted by visibility and recognition. It removed the dependency on immediate feedback and replaced it with a quieter form of self-trust. This form of discipline does not announce itself loudly. It grows gradually through repeated acts of consistency that most people would consider insignificant. But over time, these small acts accumulate into something substantial. The person who once struggled to maintain focus becomes someone who moves steadily regardless of external conditions. When others finally begin to notice the results of this discipline, they often assume the change appeared suddenly. They see the visible outcome, but remain unaware of the long period of silent development that preceded it. They interpret the composure and clarity of the individual as natural talent or sudden success. But the person who lived through the silent phase understands something different. They know that discipline practiced in obscurity reshapes the mind before it reshapes circumstances. They know that emotional independence forms slowly through moments where quitting would have been easier than continuing. And they know that the calm presence others eventually notice is not an accident. It is the quiet accumulation of discipline that was practiced long before anyone was paying attention. The quiet architecture of real power. Most people imagine power as something dramatic. They picture decisive moments, visible victories, or situations where someone clearly dominates an environment. In these mental images, power appears loud and immediate. It shows itself through control, authority, and influence that everyone can see. Because of this image, many individuals spend their lives chasing moments that look powerful rather than developing the structure that actually creates power. But real power rarely announces its arrival. Instead, it grows quietly inside the individual who learns to detach from the emotional urgency that drives most people's decisions. This detachment does not mean indifference to life or disengagement from responsibility. It means something more subtle. It means the ability to observe situations without becoming immediately absorbed by them. It means allowing events to unfold long enough to understand them before responding. This ability is rare because the human mind is naturally reactive. When something unexpected happens, the instinct is to respond quickly. When someone challenges your perspective, the instinct is to defend it. When circumstances become uncertain, the instinct is to rush toward resolution. These reactions feel natural because they promise emotional relief. Responding quickly reduces tension in the moment, even if the response itself creates new complications later. But individuals who gradually develop inner authority begin to see these patterns differently. They begin to notice how often urgency leads people into unnecessary conflict. They observe how frequently emotional reactions reveal more about a person's vulnerabilities than their strengths. They recognize that many situations resolve themselves when people are not constantly interfering with impulsive responses. This awareness changes how they move through the world. Instead of reacting immediately, they allow space to exist between what happens and how they respond. This space gives them a clearer view of the situation. They notice details others overlook. They see how people reveal their intentions through subtle shifts in tone, posture, or behavior. They observe how emotional pressure spreads through groups when tension increases. Because they are not rushing to respond, they can see the entire dynamic rather than just their own position within it. Over time, this habit of observation builds something important inside the mind. It creates a sense of internal stability. Situations that once felt chaotic begin to appear structured. Conflict becomes easier to understand because emotional noise no longer dominates perception. Decisions become clearer because they are not being made under the pressure of immediate reaction. This is where the architecture of real power begins to take shape. Power is not simply the ability to control outcomes. It is the ability to remain mentally organized when circumstances become disordered. It is the ability to maintain clarity when others are overwhelmed by emotion. And it is the ability to act deliberately even when external pressure demands impulsive responses. When someone develops this level of internal organization, their presence begins to affect the environment around them. People sense stability, even if they cannot fully explain it. Conversations slow down slightly in their presence. Conflicts often soften because emotional escalation no longer finds an immediate mirror. The individual does not need to assert authority loudly. Their calmness quietly changes the pace of interaction. This effect becomes stronger over time. As the individual continues to detach from unnecessary reactions, they also detach from the need to constantly prove themselves. Validation loses its urgency. Approval becomes less influential. Decisions begin to reflect internal clarity rather than social pressure. This independence of thought creates a form of authority that does not depend on recognition. The individual no longer needs others to confirm their direction. Instead, they move according to a structure that exists within their own thinking. Their actions become more consistent because they are not constantly adjusting to emotional signals from the environment. They become less predictable to those who rely on emotional reactions to understand people. Without obvious leverage points, it becomes difficult for others to influence their behavior through pressure or provocation. At this stage, the relationship between the individual and the world around them changes quietly but significantly. Situations that once felt threatening now appear manageable. Criticism loses much of its emotional intensity because the individual no longer depends on external approval for stability. Praise becomes less intoxicating because it is no longer necessary for motivation. The person moves through both recognition and rejection with similar composure. What emerges from this process is not dramatic dominance but something more durable. It is a calm authority that comes from internal order. An authority that does not need constant reinforcement because it is supported by disciplined thinking and emotional regulation. Others may still react, argue, or compete, but the individual who has built this internal structure remains steady within themselves. From the outside, this stability can appear mysterious. People may assume the individual possesses unusual confidence or natural composure. They may wonder how someone can remain calm while situations around them become emotionally intense. What they rarely see is the long internal process that produced this calmness. The countless moments where restraint replaced reaction. The quiet decisions where patience replaced urgency. The gradual detachment from emotional noise that allowed clarity to grow. This is the quiet architecture of real power. It is built slowly through awareness, discipline, and the willingness to observe before acting. It develops in moments where reacting would have been easier, but remaining composed created deeper understanding. And over time, the person who once searched for power in external conditions begins to recognize something unexpected within themselves. The realization that the foundation of power was never waiting somewhere outside in status, approval, or circumstance. It was forming gradually within the individual who learned to remain steady, while the world around them continued reacting.